Achim Steiner, welcome back to SABC News. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Sherwin. Good to be with you.
We are now hearing military analysts talking about a years-long war in Ukraine. The Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, now in the region trying to negotiate a humanitarian ceasefire. Millions have been cut off from essential goods and services. Griffiths told the Security Council this week as the world watches, humanitarian needs soar in Ukraine. You say this is a devastating moment for the people of Ukraine and the wider world. Explain why.
Well, I think beyond the terrible images that we have seen of destruction, of human suffering and of the fighting, what happens in war and conflicts is that, first of all, people suffer. They lose their livelihoods, and the economy begins to essentially go into a form of free fall. And, some predictions already indicate that the GDP, the gross domestic product of Ukraine, may shrink by 30 to 60% this year. We have over 10 million people in the Ukraine already displaced, 6 million internally displaced, over 4 million people having fled abroad as refugees. So you can imagine that the disruption that is happening to people's lives, firstly, as a direct consequence of the fighting, the destruction, but secondly, many small, medium-scale enterprises, businesses are closing. Roughly 50% is one estimate. Many of the manufacturing and industry infrastructure of the country has ceased operating. So we are faced with a situation where literally the economy of Ukraine will now begin to bear the brunt of this conflict and therefore have major consequences for people's ability to survive.
In March, Achim, UNDP released the development impact of the war in Ukraine, a report including initial projections. You've touched on some of those, that nearly 30% of the population would require life-saving humanitarian assistance. 18 million people are projected to be affected by the war. You mentioned the over 4 million refugees. I think that the number is around 6 million internally displaced. $100 billion in infrastructure, buildings, roads, hospitals, schools that are going to be destroyed. Given how all of this is quite antithetical to everything that UNDP stands for, how do you reposition your development work in the context of this war?
Well, together with the whole United Nations family, we work as a system. So we have our humanitarian colleagues who are obviously leading the immediate relief, providing both food and medicines and emergency accommodation. But at the same time, we are also working with the government of Ukraine because parts of the country are not yet subject to fighting. So one of the key aspects of our work is to support the government of Ukraine in maintaining the functionality of government services, both at the national level, but at the municipality level also. We are looking at how we can assist with relocating production facilities. We are looking also at cash for work programs, cash transfers that can assist with keeping people essentially in a position to be able to buy food and survive. And we're also helping, particularly at the municipal level now, with the kind of emergency work in terms of recovery, reconstruction, reconnection of basic services, but also the removal of rubble, of landmines. UNDP leads the subcluster in the UN on mine action. So these are just some of the examples that allow us in the immediate context of what is happening right now to be of assistance to the people and the country of Ukraine. And then obviously our role as UNDP is also to look at what would be a recovery and reconstruction strategy that the country could pursue. How could the international community over time be able to engage?
But you also tell us that 18 years, right? This war could wipe out 18 years of socio-economic achievements and see a return to poverty levels last seen in 2004, with direct implications on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. You have said that a worst-case scenario means that an implosion of the economy. 9 out of 10 Ukrainians could face extreme poverty and economic vulnerability if this war drags on over the next year. Peace, of course, is the first prize. What else is needed now to mitigate this worst-case scenario?
I know it's not worth perhaps repeating to some, but I think peace, the cessation of fighting, is a precondition, because otherwise, whatever we do, it is simply treating the symptom. We have to find a way in which this fighting ends. And beyond that, first of all, as you say, in the scenario that we put forward, and that was also mentioned yesterday in the Security Council discussion, if the war is protracted, if it continues, it could be that 9 out of 10, over 90% of Ukrainians could be living either below the poverty line or on the poverty line by the end of this year, beginning of next year. It is a catastrophic set of consequences that are unfolding, and clearly neither the Ukraine as a state nor the international community are able to stem this kind of free fall unless fighting stops. In the meantime, what we are trying to do is to give support to Ukraine in terms of, first of all, maintaining small, medium-scale enterprises. Very often at the community level, at the local level, these are the kind of income-earning opportunities that are there. We're also looking, obviously, at supporting the internally displaced people, because if you are able to provide them with cash transfer, they at least do not fall in destitution and literally suffer from hunger. The ability to rehabilitate, for example, healthcare facilities, reconnect electricity supplies, those are elements that in the midst of a war provide some kind of relief. And at the same time, in those parts of the country where the fighting is not happening at this moment, you're able to also provide some relief to those who have had to flee from other parts of the country, particularly the east of Ukraine. But, the situation is extremely serious. And imagine a country such as the Ukraine in less than a year and a half, falling into essentially a poverty-stricken population of 90% of its people, essentially not being able to feed themselves properly.
We're also seeing growing concern around human trafficking, sexual violence, exploitation and abuse, the long-term trauma and psychological impacts associated with any war, right? Not just in Ukraine. So it begs the question, Achim, even if there is peace today, there will be a lot of pieces to put back together, right? This is a complex task, particularly from a psychosocial point of view, not so?
Absolutely. And I think, in some ways, the images of destroyed infrastructure, apartment buildings, hospitals, and many cultural sites that have also been destroyed, those are the physical pieces of evidence. I think much more profound, and you will hear it in the testimony of mothers, of children, of grandparents that are essentially recounting the stories, both of having lost family members, but also the trauma of being caught up in the middle of fighting. Take a city such as Mariupol. It is a nightmare. And as my colleague Martin Griffiths called it yesterday, it is hell on earth right now. And I think we have seen in so many wars that in many ways, if the fighting is over, the pain, the scars, the destruction, but also the trauma continues for years to come. It is part also of a war situation that, the rule of law suffers. So what you mentioned just now in terms of trafficking, it is a high risk that we in the United Nations are extremely conscious of, particularly when so many people are on the move. Many of them are women with children. There are also those who exploit those situations. And again, all of this is part of our collective attempt to respond to this emergency in the Ukraine.
I want to talk about the damage being done to the global economy, particularly to vulnerable peoples everywhere and in developing countries in particular. To be clear, Ukraine is not the only humanitarian and development crisis facing yourselves in the international community. The SG told the Council this week that a UN analysis indicates that 74 developing countries with a population of 1.2 billion people are particularly vulnerable to spiking food, energy and fertilizer costs. Many of these economies and countries, of course, still struggling from an economic hit perpetuated and perpetrated by the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a particularly perilous moment, not just for Ukraine, but for the global economy, is it not?
It is, Sherwin. And in some ways, I think it is tragic because it kind of takes our attention away from the fact that much of the world is still dealing with the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. And indeed, in parts of the world, that pandemic rages on. And not only in terms of the health impact, but also the social and economic impacts of this pandemic are being felt across the world. In many developing nations, we estimate roughly 82 developing countries currently being debt vulnerable. Just to look at one aspect, fiscal space, as it is called, the ability of governments to spend in stabilizing economies, supporting people who have been affected by the pandemic, is severely constrained. The international financing architecture is struggling to provide the kind of support that will allow countries to move forward. And add to that now the spike in food prices, the spike in fuel prices. We are beginning to see economies run out of both. And, for instance, just the availability of wheat. We estimate that roughly 45 African and least developed countries depend for more than 1/3 of their wheat supplies on Russia and Ukraine. So the immediate impact is obvious. Add to that the spike in the cost of fuel. And you already see in a country such as Sri Lanka over the last few days, people going out on the streets when people cannot afford to buy their food. They are not able to access fuel. Political instability ensues. So the ramifications of this war go far beyond Ukraine, and they demonstrate again how interdependent we are on a global economy, and particularly for developing countries. This comes at the worst possible moment because they are already under severe stress. So we are extremely seized by this, and that is why the Secretary General of the United Nations last week set up a global crisis response group focusing particularly on the impacts on food, fuel and finance over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, I think it was David Beasley, the executive director of the World Food Programme, that talked about a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe. You touch on the international financial architecture. The UN has called for action from the G20 and international financial institutions to increase liquidity and fiscal space for governments to provide safety nets for the poorest and most vulnerable. You represent the United Nations in the finance level of the finance ministerial level of the G20. What does that conversation look like?
Well, on the one hand, we have seen, first of all, the relatively slow response during the COVID pandemic. And the G20 ultimately was at the forefront of helping to establish through the IMF, the debt sustainability facility, also a common framework to deal with the immediacy of debt repayments and creating some space. But let us be frank, the response overall of the international community, particularly wealthier nations during the pandemic, has fallen short of what the reality of the situation demanded. Add to that now the situation that we are facing in April of 2022. I think the G20 becomes critical, but also the IMF, the World Bank, the international financial architecture will come under an extraordinary scrutiny, because so far there are signals that even the G20, because of political reasons, will struggle to be as active or proactive as one would expect it to be. So much will depend on the G20 summit and the presidency that Indonesia holds at the moment, whether the G20 can continue to function. And at the same time, I think the spring meetings, as they're called, of the World Bank and the IMF, which are happening in just a few days' time, will be a vital moment at which the international community, really through these institutions, has a means to actually respond. We do need to look at extending quotas. We need to bring liquidity into essentially economies, particularly of the global south, that are unable to pay these bills. And I just remind you, in 2008, in the financial crisis, when future markets on grains began to go up steeply, it took less than 48 hours to cause riots in countries across the globe, because people, literally hundreds of millions of people, are priced out of being able to buy their basic food staples. And this is a very real risk, a very real prospect right now, in addition to the ability to buy fuel and also to deal with the debt mountain and burden that countries are carrying right now.
Yeah, and all this in the context of what the SGS has said many times, that coups are back, right? And this will only augment a rather tenuous situation. Achim, let me conclude with this. You lead the development arm of the UN, but there is also a global political and peace architecture that appears to be crumbling before our eyes. A Security Council simply not fit for purpose any longer, which then complicates the really crucial work that you and your colleagues do on the development side, right? What's your sense of how we get out of what appears to be a vicious cycle of gains and losses based on whatever man-made or natural disaster is going to hit us next?
Well, I think there is no two ways about it. We are in the midst and I think moving into a very perilous period. The question is whether wisdom and the ability, despite differences and conflicts, allows countries to regain some perspective on what matters. I mean, whether you take the multilateral architecture of the United Nations itself, the Security Council, international organizations, our international global economic system right now. If we are not careful and we begin to dismantle elements of it, we will lose an architecture that we have spent the better part of 7 decades building up. With all its imperfections, it is still a uniquely vital and valuable platform on which we as nations need to cooperate with one another, despite all our differences. This is the core idea of the United Nations after 1945. But you're right, the rule of law, the international institutions, the ability to effect decisions in support of those who are more vulnerable, who need particular support in critical moments like this, all that will suffer. And as a head of the development program, this is to me an intensely tragic moment. We have still 1 billion people who have not enough to eat before the crisis. We still have a great deal of poverty, but we've also seen that development gains have been extraordinary in recent decades. We are able to live with 8 billion people together on this planet, but not if we continue to practice what seems to, particularly in the year 2022, have become the dominant theme. conflict and competition to the point where collaboration becomes almost impossible in some areas.
Achim Steiner, we always appreciate your insights and analysis, and we thank you for sharing them with us.
Thank you.
Achim Steiner is the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and he also is chairman of the UN's Sustainable Development Group.